Good morning, Fuller community.
Good morning.
I love it. I love hearing you all. I am so honored to be with you all today, and I'm glad to be here. Julie, I want to thank you for this invitation, to you and your team, the many that are here and putting the work to create this space. What I know about Julie, I'm gonna take this time a little bit to talk about Julie. Julie, your ability to create the sacred space that holds depth and nuance is incredible. It's not just in the spoken, but it's in the unspoken, and it's just in this whole space. You create a space for this community to pause and be reminded again of why we are here. Whether we're getting ready to graduate in a couple weeks, or we're just trying to make it through the end of the quarter. You invite us into an oasis in the middle of the week as we try to gather ourselves in the midst of all the pending deadlines, and you do that week after week. So to join in your labor of love and your team's labor of love is truly a privilege, so I just want to say thank you. Amen. It has been over 8 years since I last worshiped here in chapel, and at that time I had just graduated with my MDiv here from Fuller the year before. I'd been in vocational ministry for almost a decade at that point, but seminary gave me a space, Fuller here gave me a space to ask the questions behind the questions. And it gave me new lenses to see the world in which we live. I treasured, and I still treasure, the connections to new friends, and I felt just a little bit, more equipped to make my home in this growing chasm between the church and our world. But let me just say, I did not expect what was to come. I definitely did not expect there to be a global pandemic. I'm not even sure I knew what that meant. At that point, it was not in my vocabulary. And it's as if we've lost 3 years and gained 3 years all at once. I don't know how that happened. We were all pushed past our limits, and we found that we're all stronger and more resilient than we realized. But at the same time, our weaknesses were magnified. We've lost loved ones, and we weren't even afforded the space to say our proper goodbyes. We've swallowed our grief, and we've survived. But I'm not sure that we've healed as people, as communities, and as a society. And not only that, but our news cycle, even as our news cycle seemed a little bit more like a dystopian drama series through the years, I never imagined that I would see an insurrection at the US Capitol. I definitely didn't expect to see Bible verses and Christian flags waved as we watched the attack on our democracy. And to be honest, I find it hard enough to say that I'm a Christian pastor at times, but January 6th really did not help. The stakes are higher, and we're all already exhausted. And perhaps what I also didn't realize would hit me as hard as it did were all the articles and the documentaries about pastors and churches riddled with fraud and abuse. Because even if I didn't identify with the theology and the brands of Christianity associated with these scandals, each story just felt like another gut punch. See, when I was in seminary, the data was already clear. The US church is in decline. 8 years ago, I also already knew that it would be an uphill journey after seminary. But with each disorienting event through these past years, there's one question that just kept coming to mind for me. I found myself asking all the more, why did I choose a dying profession? I mean, what was I thinking? So as a seminary graduate and an ordained minister, I resonate with this household manager's dilemma in our story today. What will I do now that the world that I dedicated myself to is going up in flames? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm too proud to beg. I already have a seminary degree, and I have my ordination certificate. What will I do if there's no people or church to serve? Whether you're in the first year of your degree or you've been tenured for years, there's something a little bit foolish about the work that we do. Because to be in this space is to have the audacity to believe that there is something to be salvaged in the intersection of the church and our world. Some of you here have the audacity to believe that there can actually be a healthy relationship between the mental health field and the church. And others here have the audacity to believe that despite the grind and the politicking of academia, the world of ideas can still impact the poor, the widow, and the orphan. Friends, we are managers in our own right, trying to bridge what we proclaim about God to this broken and messy world. And let's be honest, it's tiring to be a manager. It's exhausting to be the go-between person. It's frustrating to be somebody else's mouthpiece even when you believe the message, and it's even worse when you don't believe it. Maybe it's just me, but as much as I believe in the goodness of God, it is harder and harder to live and deliver this message. I spend more time talking about who we are not rather than who we are. And choosing the words that we use in this society is like walking through a field of landmines as words place you on one side of the aisle or the other. Friends, this is exhausting. And if it's not bad enough being stuck in the middle, I'm not sure any of us here would actually want to identify with the manager in this story. After all, this parable is known as the dishonest manager or the unrighteous manager. This is a character who is about to lose his job because of his shady practices. We aren't told exactly what he did, but he's told to hand over his documents because he's about to get fired. None of us worked multiple jobs and took out student loans just to get kicked out of seminary for violating the code of ethics. Right? We're here because we want to hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant." We are in this work as pastors, academics, therapists, and chaplains because we believe that our Christian witness will bring wholeness into this world. Amen. We're here because we want to be on the right side of history, not to be the ones who cut corners. We're here to be a prophetic presence, not to be one of those Christians. Yet what makes this parable, I think, even more complicated is that this is an internal conversation between Jesus and his disciples. Jesus is sitting in a crowd of sinners, tax collectors, and Pharisees, but he's talking to his disciples here. He's fresh off the parables of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the prodigal son, and then he turns to his disciples with this story about the dishonest manager. You know, there are parables that it's like easy to identify the protagonist, but this one isn't one of them. Even though Jesus commends the manager for being clever, he's still labeled as dishonest. And not only that, but it's not clear what exactly is commendable about what the manager did. He spends all this money that isn't his just to save himself. See, when I think about the fraud and the controversies surrounding these well-known pastors, right, this parable is one I would have left out of the Bible. Right? I mean, can you imagine with me a pastor using this passage to justify his behavior after being caught? No, not good. Right? This parable seems like an article at the back of the Therapist magazine where they have like violating the ethics, right? It's like public shaming. I feel this parable fits there. Right? It makes more sense to be this parable as like what not to do, rather than making it here. But here it is. And to make it even more complicated, Jesus, his concluding statements in this after the parable make it even more difficult to understand. I mean, is Jesus saying that money matters? Is Jesus saying money doesn't matter? Because if Jesus is trying to send a clear message to his disciples about what to do and what not to do, it's definitely not working. But maybe that's just it. Maybe it's confusing because God's economy just won't make sense in this world. In a world where resources are limited and there are the haves and the have-nots, this passage makes no sense. In a world where there are clear winners and losers, it doesn't make sense. In a world where it's either right or it's wrong, Jesus' life lessons for his disciples sounds disconnected and out of touch. It's difficult to make sense of this parable because we live in a zero-sum world. We live in a world where everything hangs on a balance. If one side gains, then the other side loses. We're all fighting for our piece of the pie because we know that power and resources are limited. So of course, it makes no sense that the rich man would be okay losing money, because his loss would mean another's gain, whether the manager or the people who owe him. And even if the manager keeps his job from cutting the bills, it means that somebody else would have to pay the cost in a zero-sum world. But in the economy of God's mercy, we find ourselves with a very different reality. Because if God's mercy is great enough to hold the prodigal son and the elder brother, then there is no record of who wins and who loses. If God's mercy is rich and abundant, then there are more than enough resources to go around for everyone. If God is mercy, then it's really not about the debt to be paid, but it's about God's reputation as a merciful, generous, and abundant God. See, I think this is where being a daughter of immigrant kind of helps me out a little. Because whether it was running an errand or answering the home phone, I always knew from a very young age that I was a representation or an extension of my parents. When I filled the teacups at the dim sum table, because I was the daughter and the youngest, people would tell my mom that she came from a good family. When I greeted people with respect and with honor, my dad was told that he knew how to be a good person. Or the literal translation in a Cantonese phrase that I'm thinking of is, he knows how to be human. He has humanity. It wasn't about what I did, but it's about who I am. Who I am reflects the village that formed me, my parents, my communities, my friends, and my mentors. That's who I am. And perhaps in the same way, the parable really isn't about the dishonest manager, but maybe it's about the honor of the rich man. Because if this passage is about honor and the character of the rich man, then a cost-benefit analysis doesn't make sense. But instead, the manager is an extension of the rich man's generosity. It's about mercy that doesn't fit in the world's expectations. It's about equity and compassion as the economic standard. And it's about dignity that colors between the lines because it makes room for people's humanity. If this passage is a story about God's mercy for Jesus' disciples, then it changes our position as a manager. It changes the conversation completely because it's no longer about settling accounts, making profits, or performance evaluation. But instead, it's about banking on the mercy of God. It's about boldly acting as an extension and a representation of God in our world. It's about being in a position to demand that God's mercy come here. And it's about challenging the zero-sum realities of our world by forcing God's hand to be kind and compassionate. I do love when Scripture reminds us of just how small and limiting our world is compared to God's economy. It gives me hope to know that what we see in this world is not how it's meant to be. But I also know that seeing God's economy lived out feels impractical at best and overwhelmingly impossible on most days. So even when I'm not in my mini crisis wondering if I chose a dying profession, I see a world that's crying out in pain. We don't have to look far to be convinced of a zero-sum world. If anything, it feels like we are all losing out. A zero-sum world hurts us all. No one wins when we're confused about which mass shooting we're talking about when we're in conversation with each other. No one wins when people are unable to pay rent when the eviction moratorium ends. No one wins when our lakes are drying up and we're trying to fight over how much water we can use. And no one wins when Bible verses and prayers are the motivation for treason. Friends, as managers caught between the realities of God's mercy and our weary world, I think it's really hard to imagine what this means. This parable is spoken directly to Jesus' disciples, to the ones that he entrusts to live out God's economy in this world. But I wonder, maybe, just maybe, that the gift of this parable is actually found in this complexity. Maybe the invitation into God's mercy for us is actually in the ambiguity and the conflicting messages. As we embrace the ambiguity and the tensions of this passage, maybe that's where we will find the most honest versions of ourselves. That even as we stand out and speak out against the systems that we hate, we still find ourselves attached to those very systems. We can stand on behalf of workers' rights, but we still use Amazon when we need to get that book on time. We can scroll through social medias for the updates on the latest megachurch scandal, but we still worry about paying for our bills when our congregations dwindle. We can condemn that version of Christianity, but assume that we can convince other people of our more pure and our more thorough theology. We can talk about healing and wholeness, but we find ourselves still disconnected in our relationships and longing for rest. So, for the dishonest and the unrighteous managers in this space today, how do you need God's mercy? How do you need God's mercy to find you? How do you need God's mercy to help you examine your complexities, your contradictions, and paradoxes? Friends, this is not an easy time to be alive, and it's not an easy time to be a follower of Jesus. But God's mercy will not be forced into the binary of winners and losers. God's abundant mercy doesn't allow for us to judge other people or ourselves, but it allows for honesty and compassion. God's mercy is for the losers of this world in which the zero-sum realities just don't apply. So, for the pastors and the ministers in this room, did we choose a dying profession? Maybe. Maybe we did. Maybe we did. But maybe that's just the way it needs to be, for us to be a people who are secure in God's mercy alone. Maybe our dwindling churches are our saving grace. Perhaps it's in accepting our decline that we will imperfectly force God's hand of compassion. And maybe as we learn to rest in the ambiguity of our callings, we find ourselves secure in God's generosity. In this season of our weary world, may we be a people who are secure in God's mercy. May Jesus' compassion seek us when we find that our foundations are lacking or cracking. And may the Spirit empower us to embrace the ambiguity and the messiness of this world with open hands. Amen.